G'day, Dr. Carl, University of Sydney, Shirtloads of Science. And today we're talking about a cancer that will affect 2 out of 3 Australians. And due to some dodginess somewhere, people are being put at a higher risk of this. We're talking skin cancer, we're talking sunscreens, and we're talking with, luckily today, nice segue, John Alexander Staton, S-T-A-T-O-N, 1T.
That's correct.
And so it says here that you've been working in this field for 60 years in pharmaceutical and healthcare, and mainly in research and development related roles, and also laboratory testing. That's a big thing in your career, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and the background to it, for those who are not entirely up to speed, is that recently Choice Magazine tested 20 sunblocks and found that 16 of them failed to give the protection they wanted. Instead of being, in one case, SPF, what does that stand for? Sun protection factor 50?
Or 50 plus, which is actually a minimum of 60.
So that's why you're here. So instead of providing a SPF or sun protection factor of 50, it provided one of 4. Not 40, 4, which means that if in good faith you paid for this and used it, and then got skin cancer, could you say that that company was the reason you got skin cancer and could potentially die because of their dodgy testing? Is that sort of the background? I'm getting very extreme here, like a bit of sludgy media here. But let's try and take it from a higher level. Now, what is your pathway? So how did you go from high school into being able to running your own testing laboratories?
Well, I was fortunate enough to walk straight out of school into a job just up the road in the School of Pharmacy.
Here in the University of Sydney.
Sydney University. Purely at the bottom end, if you like. Lab assistants, we were called. We set up the experiments for the students at that time.
And it's always good to start at the bottom because it gives you a solid base.
Absolutely. And the solid base to me was I had to work through all the exercises in prac of the students in their second and third year of university, and virtually repeating the same exercise over again. So I almost learned the formulations that they worked through at the time, because they were actually making the products. We called it extemporaneous. It's now called it like compounding pharmacy, you would know it as, but essentially homemade, customised products, not products produced in batches commercially. So that was what those labs did.
How did you end up going from there to actually running your own testing laboratory?
Well, the next fortune I fell upon was that Sol Pattinson's employed me.
And so they were a big...
They were a big pharmacy group, yeah.
And weren't they fully vertically integrated, which is fancy talk from making it to distributing it to selling it to the customer?
That's correct. Yeah. And so the integration was, my end was the manufacturing end, and we serviced all of the products that were sold in the pharmacies, mainly house brand at the time. And as well as that, we manufactured quite a few other high-end products for contract on a contract basis.
So it says here that you were the general manager of Sol Pattinson Laboratories, which would mean you'd know an awful lot of stuff and you'd be testing the stuff as well as making it.
Well, it's a lot of fun then because, yes, I had to cover the whole scope from R&D to quality assurance to issues in the factory with production to dealing with the retail pharmacists and the feedback, of course, from customers. And you couldn't get a better position than that one.
And then you got to the stage where, so you set up your own laboratories as well?
After I left that employment, yes. About 30 years ago, I set up my own laboratories.
Right. And then further down the line, it says that in 2022, just a few years ago, you were presented by the International Federation of Societies of Cosmetic Chemists with the award of being a fellow of that society.
That's correct.
Wow. And the ASCC Jack Jacobs Award for Best Australian New Zealand Cosmetic Research on 4 occasions, and a whole bunch of other things. So you know about testing, and I'm guessing we're sort of heading towards that. If you try to test something and the measurements that you measure, say the length of something 100 times, your measurements are not like this. Nothing, 101 of those, exactly the right measurement, and then nothing. But there's a bit of a scatter. And that apparently is part of the problem. We're talking here about potentially suboptimal testing by suboptimal laboratories, as they call themselves, is part of the background.
Yeah, according to the evidence I have, and I've actually been in a position now where I consult specifically on that issue. It's to do with supporting people with sunscreens. That's my 100% focus now in my retirement days. So the data I have before me would indicate that the results are too consistent to be realistic science.
That's right. They just look too good. And so, for example, it turns out that many of the Australian companies, so 20 companies were tested and only 4 passed, according to Choice magazine, in what they promised as the SPF rating was actually delivered, and 16 failed. Actually, let's just back here. How do you actually measure an SPF rating? Do you just simply get the sunscreen and you squirt onto a little glass tablet and you shove it in a box and bingo, out comes a number? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's far more complicated. You've got all of the sciences coming in to clash together. You've got the physics of what happens with a sunscreen. You've got the chemistry and the formulation of a sunscreen. And then you've got human biology, because we test on live, real, volunteer test subjects.
Hang on. I really thought that you just sort of got the stuff and put it in a machine that went bing or beep or something. So you actually test the SPF factor, that's sun protection factor, on humans. By the way, what does sun protection factor mean? When they say it's got a sun protection factor of, say, 5, what does that mean?
Well, it really means, to the public, their expectation is that they could stay in the sun 5 times longer without getting what we define as a mild erythema. Mild erythema is the burn you get when you get home, which is only just like a slight pink coloration of the skin. Might end up as a sunburn.
Okay, so you get the test subjects. Now, just a bit of background. Landing on the ground from the sun, the radiation from the sun is roughly half of it is heat, and we measure the colour of light, if you call it colour, in a wavelength, and we use a thing called a nanometer, which is a billionth of a metre. So infrared, which we can't see with our eyes, but you can feel with your skin, is 700 nanometres up, and then 700 to 400 is red to blue, and we can see that with our eyeballs. And then down here, from 400 down to, how far down?
290.
So from 400 down to 290, and that's ultraviolet, that's 1% or less, and that's the stuff that gives us skin cancer, right? And you're saying that you're going to make your... this still blows my mind, that the SPF test is done on a human. So you take me through it. So you expose them to a certain amount of ultraviolet. Your machine is called, what do you call your machine?
They're called a solar simulator.
Okay, so it doesn't actually simulate the whole sunlight, just the ultraviolet part. And so you squirt them with a certain amount of radiation for a certain amount of time. And how long do you wait to estimate the redness?
We read the response 16 to 24 hours after, very specific time frame.
You call them back?
We call them back the next day, and we read them in the lab after we've cooled them down, and there's no influence from the environmental because they were late for their appointment. So we sit them there for 20 minutes and virtually stabilise them at a controlled temperature, and then we read the back, and the person who does that is very, very skilled.
So it's a human. So a human reads the amount of redness on another human's skin.
Yep.
This is very different from just squirting it onto a glass thing, hitting the light and hitting the button and getting a bing.
Yeah, and experimentally I've shown that the human eye is more sensitive than the scientific instrument that we normally would measure colour with. So we know that actually our eyes are pretty accurate as long as they're well trained. So we train them. Actually, we train them with an exercise, and then we make sure we put them through a Munsell test, which is a colour acuity test. So that's their ability to discriminate between the red and the blue that you've just mentioned, the endpoint. So the redder it is, the more intense it is.
Now, I just suddenly realised something. On one hand, you're looking at something that takes a lot of time, and on the other hand, time is money. So if I wanted to cut corners and I was running a dodgy lab, it'd be so easy to bypass even that first stage. Okay, so then so the sun protection factor of 5 means that instead of, let me just sort of try and put this into plain English, that instead of taking 10 minutes of exposure to give you redness, it would take 10 times 5, 50 minutes. And then with sun protection factor of 50, instead of taking 5 minutes, it take you 50 by 5, which is 250 minutes. Have I got that right?
10 minutes is about an erythema for the lightest coloured skin.
That's what you find in your laboratories.
And 15 minutes is an erythema for the top end of where we measure, which we call the type 3 skin, which is, it's like the sort of person you'd see who's really white but they're tanned on the beach. So that sort of colour. After that, we can't see the erythema. It's too dangerous to try and put it against a dark background. So we stop, that's why we don't test people with very dark skin. It's not a bias, it's because we need to experimentally be sure that we're remaining in the ethics of the experiment, which is dictated again in the standard by the Helsinki Accord on Ethics for Testing Humans.
And I can see so many places a dodgy company would want to cut corners. So then, how do you know then if a laboratory follows the right procedure, or just simply says, oh, we tested your stuff, give us $40,000 and here's the results, and look, what a narrow scatter we've got, aren't we wonderful? How is there some sort of international standard for testing laboratories themselves?
The international standard says that they must produce sufficient information so that we can identify where some of the controls within the experiment have been exceeded. So provided the laboratories providing that document in its correct form, then it's not difficult to identify where they might have taken shortcuts.
Now, in my various paths, I've come across the letters ISO, which stands for International
Standards Organisation.
So is there an International Standards Organisation for testing laboratories and then diving down laboratories that test sunscreen?
There are international standards for both of those activities, but they're not mandated at this stage.
Really?
And because of the expertise that's involved in the sun screening, and keep in mind there are more methods than just SPF, there's broad spectrum, there's water resistance.
In these are other factors as
Europeans, they have a percentage of wash-off, they have a kind of a factor. I call it the 50% discount deal, but in Australia we're very strict. We measure our SPF post whatever the water challenge might be, up to 4 hours. So we really have a lot of methods that would then have to be specifically audited by that system. It's happening, but it's at its very rudimentary stage at this time.
And so it seems as the company that's at the centre of this, called Princeton Consumer Reports, is run by somebody who had a bit of a dodgy past with company business and not being allowed to run company and various dodgy things. And they're the ones that have got the results that look just too good to be true. All the scientists are saying the results are just too good to be true. There's not enough scatter.
You would expect unevenness because you're dealing with human skin, and even though we control all the parameters we can actually control under the practicalities of using test volunteers, the question really remains of how you're dealing with that data, or whether in fact the data is completely produced according to the process. But I have access to so many reports that I can pretty well identify the shortcuts that may have been made along the way. So it's possible to do it if you can audit the data and not the laboratory.
Well, in this particular case, one of the worst performing companies was a company called Ultraviolet, and they did have a lovely story. Like, there was a female founder, which is good. They were an Australian success story, which is good. They got $15 million in equity funding in New York, which is good. They positioned themselves in the prestige beauty market, and so you're thinking, well, this is good. But unfortunately, they went testing through this Princeton Consumer Laboratory, and according to the results I've been seeing, when tested by choice, they had a sun protection factor of 4, or tested by a German company 5, but from PCR, the Princeton Consumer Research, they got a rating of 50 plus.
The pathway to skin cancer probably starts for most of us the first time we're exposed to the light, and not necessarily from the use of a product over the duration of the pack we purchase. But I would suggest more that people will know if the sunscreen's working, because when sunscreens work, you don't get the erythema. So if the product's been doing that, then there's a good chance in a lot of these cases that people aren't exposed to any more than 4 or 5 units of full UV light, full spectrum unit at the fullest intensity over the period of a day of their normal activities. Typically the products that are been in the recall are products that I would suggest are so expensive they're unlikely to be put all over your body. So they're more likely to be used on the face and the hands, and people who are doing only that, I suspect, and the majority would be people who are not going out and exposing themselves undressed.
I think you did right, because they might be just sort of putting a small amount on their face and then going out for the afternoon or so. But ultraviolet, instead of saying, let's go and test this with an independent third-party company, doubled down, and then somehow all of their influencers, who are just basically paid endorsers, then piled onto Choice and attacked them for both their methodology and their reputation, without knowing that in fact Choice was correct and that ultraviolet had been involved with a company that gave them dodgy results. So that's a whole different other story in the background as well.
Can I say, Carl, that from the point of view of the credibility of Choice's testing, consumer groups these days are extremely organised. They're virtually running as international organisations, affiliated, comparing notes, preparing their protocols for their tests very carefully, and then selecting the labs that they identify as having a good reputation to run the testing. And I would totally rely on the testing from those consumer organisations that I've dealt with, and I've dealt with many.
Well, Choice Magazine did say that the results were so astonishingly low that they thought that there could be a problem with Choice's end, so they sent the stuff overseas for another reputable laboratory to test, and came back with virtually identical results. Sun protection factor of 5 instead of 4, which is way below 50 plus. So that backs up what you were saying, that they're trying to maintain their good reputation and working with integrity. So on one hand, we've got the situation where a semi-private organisation, the consumer organisation, seem to be doing very high-quality testing. But on the other hand, how come the government, which has supposedly this long-term view of looking after the economic affairs of the country and the environment, but also the health of the citizens, how come it's not being involved?
Well, the regulator in this case is the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and mainly their controls are to do with the quality of the manufacturer and not necessarily the quality of auditing related to the sponsor, who's the person for putting the product on the market. So in the end, that responsibility for the claim substantiation, as it's called, rests with the sponsor. Also applies with under ACCC. So when you go back to that, because they're fairly naive and you understand they're not technically competent in many, many situations, they rely and they trust in the manufacturer. So in some degree, you have to go back and say, down the chain of the process of the cradle, if you like, to grave, who really tripped up.
Right, so I can see there's potential cracks in the pavement where things could fall through, and that seems to have happened in this case.
And it could be something to do with the formulation itself that's at fault, and you have to isolate again the SPF 4 situation, which is extreme, from the situation for most of the other products, which it did achieve quite a substantial SPF efficacy, even though it didn't quite make the number.
Okay, so we now know that there's sort of gaps in the system. We know that bad things can slip through accidentally. We know that it is possible to have suboptimal testing laboratories, which seems to have been the case in this situation. But let's go back to a really basic thing. How do sunscreens work? And I'm going to say something, and you tell me how wrong I am. So firstly, there's the ones like zinc, which just simply reflect away the ultraviolet. Is that correct? No, wrong. Okay, tell me where I'm wrong.
If you're looking at the kind of zinc that you see the cricketers wearing out on the cricket pitch, then it's obviously reflecting the light because it happens to reflect as white light. So that's the war paint version of the material, the raw material, zinc oxide, which is in coarse particle form, even if it's British Pharmacopoeia or European Pharmacopoeia grade. It's not the kind of stuff that works for sunscreens. The kind of stuff...
It doesn't reflect the ultraviolet?
It reflects, but you wouldn't use it because you'd end up with a death mask all over your skin. So we don't use that grade. The grade we use is much finer in nanoparticle size, or neo-nano, as I like to call it now. And it absorbs UV light.
And what happens to the energy in the UV light? Does that get turned into heat?
Turns into peroxides.
It changes the chemical from one form to another.
Yes. It generates peroxizers, reactive oxygen species. Yeah.
So the ROS of the reactive...
ROS is an output of that absorbance.
Okay, so I got it wrong.
The photons of light.
So with the zinc type ones, the ultraviolet comes in, and where I was wrong was where I thought it was being reflected. In fact, it changes the zinc into something else, but the ultraviolet does not get through the skin. So there's a chemical change in the zinc sitting on your face. So is that correct? Am I right so far?
You've got chemistry and physics happening at once. You're basically right in that it's not to do with reflection only.
Now we'll go with the second grade. Then there's the non-zincy ones, and there are all sorts of chemicals. And my understanding was that the ultraviolet came in and got turned into heat. Tell me where I'm wrong.
In most cases, it's heat.
Ah.
In some cases, you'll see it as light because you can get those molecules to the degraded product to reflect light. If you've ever seen those demos you now see on TV where they put a UV light on a face and it turns black, then you're seeing the fluorescence. So it actually turns back into another wavelength of light.
Okay, so to summarise, with the zinc type ones, the ultraviolet comes in and turns the zinc into another chemical, but the ultraviolet doesn't get through, or only a very small percentage does. And with everything else, the ultraviolet lands on it and sometimes gets turned into heat, and then sometimes it gets
into light.
It gets reflected as visible light. Man, I've learned so much today, John. Now, look, thank you for taking me through this pathway. I've just sort of touched on a tiny bit of it. How can people follow you and your fine work and learn more? And I had so many things wrong in my head about sunscreen before I started talking with you.
Well, if you're happy with the Tech Talk, you can follow me on LinkedIn. That's primarily where I publish my little articles these days, other than in the specific science arena, which it would involve you joining a member of some scientific organisation.
And what name do you go under on LinkedIn?
Find me under John Staton.
John Staton, not double T. Thank you so much for coming in and correcting all the wrong things that I had in my brain. Look, thank you, John.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Carl, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.